There are moments in history when darkness does not lie in the color of human skin, but in the hands that rewrote the past. People often assume that the thrones of Europe once belonged only to white faces, yet, when one looks deeper into the dust covered statues inside old churches and the stained glass windows shimmering with ancient light, a truth begins to rise like a voice calling from stone and earth. It is the face of black kings, 10 generations across nearly 8 centuries, who once ruled lands that written history tried to conceal. The story is no longer about race, but a question of why the memory of an entire people was pushed into silence. Across the layered centuries of Europe, from Spain to Sicily, from Germany to the distant Caucasus, the traces carved by ancient hands still stand as silent witnesses. And when one gazes upon these witnesses, the soul feels drawn into a dim realm where memory and the unseen world meet. Their history no longer appears as pages in a book, but as fragments of memory struggling to rise and speak their names again. Like the words in ancient scripture that say, the nations at the ends of the earth will bring their offerings to God, there is something in this story that makes the listener sense a forgotten journey, a lineage that once shone brightly, but became covered in dust by the will of those who held the pen. When the eye looks through the figures of saints, the carved wooden reliefs, the colored glass inside Europe's churches, one can see faces that clearly do not belong to the image of white Europeans. Thick lips, curled hair, deep toned skin, eyes that seem to pierce through the centuries. These features are not accidental, not decorative, but the imprint of an age when black kings wore crowns at the heart of this continent. And when the listener stands before these traces, the soul feels pushed into a space older than human history itself, where impressions of the past flow like underground water that never dries. Perhaps this is why speaking of the Black Kings of Europe does not feel like discovery, but recognition, as if the mind has always known this truth, yet was forced to forget. The silence of history books is not the end of the story, for the stones still remember, and the light through stained glass continues to reveal the true faces of those who once ruled. From the day Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the sea to the day Boabdil left Granada in tears, this stream of history lasted 800 years, long enough to form a great chapter, yet fragile enough to be blurred by the hands of power. And yet something in the unseen realm whispers that what has been buried is never truly lost. It waits, it waits for the moment when history opens its door, waits for a generation willing to listen, waits to be called again by its true name. When one looks back at the fragments of that age, it is as though a distant echo says that hidden stories were never meant to remain hidden, but to rise when the right time comes, like pages of prophecy not revealed to the casual reader, but to those who seek with their whole soul. Therefore, when we retell what has been erased from history, we are not only restoring the past, but calling forth what the unseen world once witnessed. The listener does not simply step into a lesson about history, but walks into a spiritual memory that has been sealed for centuries. And in this moment, as truth is spoken again, the listener understands that nothing stays concealed forever. Light always returns to the place that has been darkened. The history of the Black Kings, once written by human hands, but erased by those same hands, is now being awakened by the flow of a new era where truth and memory meet again. And the story begins here as a promise that what was buried will be called to rise, what was forgotten will be spoken again, and the thrones once covered in dust will stand once more in the light. When looking deeply into the timeline of Europe, there is a moment that appears like a streak of light across the night, dividing the old world from the new. That moment did not come from northern courts or the white knights described in school books, but from a band of warriors who crossed the sea with faces darkened by desert sun and eyes sharp as blades reflecting fire. They did not arrive like a passing wind, but like an imprint destined on the map of history. Their leader bore the name Tariq ibn Ziyad, a name pushed out of public memory, yet still carved into the stone of the land where he set foot. That stone, Jabal Tariq, or Gibraltar, stands like a great doorway that the unseen hand of time cracked open. When the ships reached the shore, it was not merely people stepping onto a continent, but an entirely new era entering. Chronicles captured the image of Tariq's soldiers as horsemen with reins like fire faces, black as pitch, and the pounding of their hooves shaking the very soul of Iberia. Christian historians called them darkness pouring down from the south, yet a quiet voice from the realm of the spirit whispered that this was not darkness, but the turning of order allowed by the Most High. For throughout ages, he has permitted kingdoms to rise and fall so that humanity would learn no throne is eternal unless grounded in truth. When Tariq looked upon the Visigoth army, a battle ignited not only in the visible world, but in the invisible currents of destiny. The Visigothic Empire had stood for centuries, yet in a single day of history, it cracked like an old clay vessel struck upon stone. Witnesses described the moment with trembling voices, but in the depth of vision, it appears as only one link in a much larger design. From that collapse would grow a new kingdom, one Europe had never known, a kingdom carrying the breath of Africa into the heart of a white continent. Tariq was not merely a commander opening a way, he was a hinge of a moving door. Before he arrived, Europe looked south as if gazing into a distant unknown. After he stepped in, Europe was forced to learn itself anew. And from that moment, the 800-year story of the Moors began. When standing before the shores of Gibraltar in the realm of imagination, the sea appears to shimmer with silver, as if reflecting the secrets time tried to hide. Across misty layers of atmosphere, an image takes shape like a memory that refuses to disappear. It is the army of Tariq beneath the sun, their armor dark, their faces unlike the familiar depiction of early Europeans. Every step they took on new soil echoed voices from ages far older when peoples from the south had crossed this land long before history was rewritten. Why did they arrive in that exact year? Why did a place seemingly distant from Africa become the key that opened a new chapter for Spain? When these questions are asked, the answers no longer lie in old textbooks, but in deeper pathways where the one who sees visions can recognize a principle written in scripture. Great nations do not fall because of their enemies, but because their appointed time has reached fullness. The Visigothic kingdom then had lost its breath, its throne fractured from within, its people divided. And in a world where the law of rise and decline governs empires, a new power would always step forward. Tariq was simply the chosen vessel. When the sound of the horses reverberates through the soul, the listener can feel the shift of history like waves striking an ancient cliff. It is a sound that announces an ending and a beginning at the same time. And upon it, the face of Tariq becomes a symbol representing every black figure who stepped onto European soil, not as a slave or a disregarded outsider, but as one who shaped an era. If one listens closely, another layer of voice mingles with the sound of waves. It does not belong to historians or soldiers, but seems to rise from the place where history and the spirit world meet. It says these people did not come to change the color of thrones, but to awaken the memory Europe wanted to forget, that the lineage of Africa once stood equal to any dynasty on this continent. And when looking at Gibraltar today, some may see only rock and sea, but others will see a doorway that once opened so history could speak the truth that darkness tried to hide. That doorway still remains like a crack in time where light pours in. It reminds us that buried memory is not lost memory, but memory waiting to be called forth. And when called, it becomes a witness shaking the distorted stories of the past. Now that Tariq's story is told, again, the listener will see clearly that this is neither myth nor exaggeration, but the voice of a history reclaiming its truth. Because from those first footsteps on Gibraltar, a whole age of black kings in Europe began, and Europe was never the same again. At the end of this part, allow me to ask you something. When hearing this story, what do you feel awakening within you? An ancient memory, a new question, or stirring to name? Share it, for your presence is part of what brings this story back to life. Thank you for listening. Across the unfolding tapestry of time, there rises a city whose lamps once glowed brighter than any corner of Europe. It was not Paris, nor London, nor Rome, but a place shaped by the hands and vision of men whose heritage flowed from the sands of Africa. Cordoba, crowned in the Andalusian night, shone with a radiance that startled the world. And when one looks back through the dim corridors of history, it becomes clear that the story of the city was never merely political or architectural. It was a revelation of what rises when broken lineages are gathered again and set into the stream of destiny. After Tariq opened the gate upon Iberian soil, others followed in the rhythm of time. Among them was a prince fleeing death, carrying the memory of a dynasty shattered by massacre. His name was Abd al-Rahman I. Dark of complexion, tall, marked with the bearing of African lineage, he crossed deserts, escaped assassins, and reached the western edge of the world. There, instead of falling into obscurity, he planted a kingdom. It was as if something unseen had preserved him for a work that demanded both survival and vision. Cordoba, under his hand, did not simply grow, it awakened. The gardens spread like living poetry. The water channels whispered with the discipline of African engineering, and the great mosque rose with arches that seemed to breathe. Beneath its red and white columns, the air carried a quiet authority, as if the stones themselves remembered the journey of the people who built them. For Abd al-Rahman did not rule as an intruder on foreign soil. He ruled as a man stepping into a destiny already written in a deeper ledger. And yet, what he began was only the seed. Generations later came Abd al-Rahman III, the ruler who declared himself Caliph of Cordoba, placing his kingdom alongside Baghdad and Cairo. His skin was dark, his hair thick and curled, his ancestry unmistakably African, even to the scribes who wrote of him. And yet, in later centuries, the painters of Europe sought to wash the truth from his face. They lightened his skin, narrowed his features, gentled his hair, as if history would be more acceptable if his likeness were molded into the image Europe preferred. But truth never disappears. It only waits beneath the surface like a river running silent beneath rock. Those who saw him in his lifetime described him as he truly was. And through their words, the shadow of erasure breaks, revealing the man who presided over the brightest jewel of medieval Europe. Under his reign, Cordoba was unlike any city of its age. While the streets of London and Paris lay dark and muddy, Cordoba was lit by lamps that stretched for miles. More than 70 Libraries filled its quarters, overflowing with knowledge drawn from Africa, Arabia, and lands far beyond the horizon. Scholars found refuge there. Doctors, mathematicians, poets, and astronomers gathered as though drawn by an unseen star. The city thrived not through war alone, but through the flowering of the mind. And in that flowering, something profound can be sensed, something that moves beneath the facts recorded by history. When one contemplates Cordoba through the quiet vision of the inner eye, the city appears not only as a center of learning, but as a lamp raised high over a continent drowning in ignorance. In this way, it mirrors a verse known to many: a city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Yet there is a deeper truth entwined within it. Light that rises through human hands can be dimmed or distorted, for men will always rewrite what they do not wish to remember. But the true light, the one that comes from beyond the rise and fall of empires, cannot be altered. It shines even when history attempts to bury its lantern. And so Cordoba stands in memory as more than a Moorish capital. It is a reminder that brilliance can emerge from the very people the world later tries to diminish. In the quiet of reflection, one may sense that the rise of Cordoba was not an accident of conquest, but a moment allowed, perhaps even ordained, to reveal that Africa had not only shaped the cradle of civilization, but could shape the future of Europe as well. When the lamps of Cordoba burned, they illuminated far more than streets. They revealed the forgotten truth that wisdom is not bound to geography, that nobility is not tied to color, and that greatness can bloom from those the world tries to erase. In the stillness of that realization, one sees that the story of Cordoba is not finished. Its arches still breathe, its stones still speak, and its light still reaches into the present, whispering that whatever has been buried by human hands can be uncovered by time itself. For the erasing of a people is never final. Their memory moves like wind beneath locked doors. And when the season comes, it rises. Now you listening to this unfolding tale stand at the threshold of this memory. Cordoba is not only a place long ago, it is a reminder that truth endures even when painted over. As you hear of its lamps and its arches, as you sense the weight of its forgotten kings, let this question settle into your heart. What hidden light in your own story is waiting to rise again? There are moments when the veil between ages thins, and I'm allowed to look into a world that has not vanished, only withdrawn into the memory of stone. When this vision opens, I am no longer standing in my own time. I am carried across Andalusia over the red earth and olive groves to the echoing footsteps of kings whose names the centuries tried to silence. I see Mansour first rising like a shadow carved from iron. His presence moves across the land with a certainty that does not come from ambition alone, but from a destiny already set before him. His complexion is dark, his features unmistakably shaped by the sun of Africa, and yet he stands in the heart of Europe as if Europe had been waiting for him. I watch him command his armies, moving with a discipline that unsettled the kingdoms of the north. They wrote of him with trembling ink, describing the raids that swept through Christendom. But in the vision, I see something deeper. His footsteps were not merely those of a conqueror. They were the strides of a man reminding a continent that power is not born of skin, but of spirit. Then the scene shifts. The horizon widens. The land beneath me turns from the plains of Spain to the sands of the Sahara, and then with a breath to the shores of the Mediterranean. Yusuf ibn Tashfin arises, thin in frame, dark in skin, disciplined in spirit. He moves with the gravity of someone who knows he carries the weight of two continents. His empire stretches from Morocco into Spain like a bridge of destiny binding Africa and Europe into one story. I see him at Sagajaz, the Christian armies trembling the air thick with dust and prophecy. Yet, in the stillness of the vision, I sense no cruelty in him, only inevitability. The tides of history had turned, and Yusuf was the wind that carried them. The voices of chroniclers have long reduced him to a fearsome name, but here, in the quiet of revelation, I see a man who understood that thrones do not belong to races. They belong to eras. And his era burned bright, but the vision does not stop with kings of war. It pulls me across the sea into Sicily, where the air tastes of salt, citrus, and ancient memory. Palermo unfolds before me like a jewel set in gold. I see Hassan al-Kalbi, the African ruler whose hands shaped this island into wonder of the Mediterranean. Beneath my feet, the city glows as if lit from within. Gardens fed by intricate irrigation flow in channels cut with precision, a knowledge carried from deserts far older than Europe. Above me rise arches that echo the design of Cordoba, bending like ribs of a living being. And everywhere mosaics glimmer, tiny fragments of colored glass arranged with the patience of prayer. The gold in them catches light as if remembering a sum that once crowned the faces of their makers. In the vision, I let my hand rest upon the walls of Palermo. They are cool, but beneath the surface, there is a pulse. And I understand something that the world has forgotten. Stone does not lie. When men rewrite chronicles, when painters bleach the skin of kings, when scholars hide what does not fit their story, the stone keeps its memory. It records what human pride tries to erase. The churches built upon the bones of the old city carry this testimony. Their foundations rest on Moorish arches. Their walls hold the patterns of African artisans. And in their quiet sanctuaries, the light moves across mosaics whose creators were not Europeans, but black rulers from the south. I hear a whisper in the stones, not in words, but in resonance. And it reminds me of a truth written long before these kingdoms rose. If men keep silent, the stones will cry out. Now I understand that these cities are not ruins. They are living witnesses. They are scripture written in architecture. They are chapters of a story buried not because it was false, but because it was too true. As the vision widens, I see the three lands at once: Andalusia, Morocco, Sicily, glowing like points of fire across the map. They are bound by a lineage that Europe once acknowledged in art, in cathedrals, in chronicles before fear or pride reshaped the narrative. The black thrones of Europe were real. Their kings walked through courts and palaces that still stand. Their voices once rang through chambers now filled with the echo of choirs. And though their names were pushed into the margins of history, their imprint has not faded. It remains in arches, in waterways, in patterns of toil, in the very layout of cities. I stand at the center of this vision, watching the light move over these lands. And I feel the weight of history rise from the ground, not as burden, but as witness. The thrones may have fallen, the kings exiled or forgotten, but the memory carved into stone is beyond the reach of erasure. It waits for the time when truth is called forth again. Now, as the vision closes, one realization settles quietly within me. The stones of Europe have carried this truth longer than any surviving book, and they will continue to speak long after the voices that denied it are gone. For the memory of a people cannot be buried when the earth itself has become their testimony. Across the quiet interior of medieval cathedrals, where candlelight flickers against ancient walls and choirs send echoes upward into vaulted ceilings, there are figures who have watched Europe for centuries without speaking. Their presence is carved in stone, shaped in wood, and painted in glass. They stand not on the margins, but at the very center of the places considered most sacred. And when one looks closely, a revelation appears. These figures are African. Their faces are unmistakably dark. Their features hold the wide nose, the full lips, the tightly curled hair of a lineage rooted far to the south of Europe. One of the most striking among them is Saint Maurice of Magdeburg. In the vision of history, he rises not merely as a saint, but as a commander, a knight forged in loyalty and courage. His statue stands in the cathedral bearing armor of a royal warrior with a calm strength carved into every angle of his face. It is not a stylized image, nor an ambiguous one. His complexion is deep and dark. The sculptor captured the texture of his coiled hair with deliberate precision. The eyes are set with the dignity of a king, not a servant. Art historians have long noted that this depiction is not symbolic. It is literal. The man carved into the heart of Germany is African. As the centuries passed, kings, bishops, and emperors walked beneath his gaze. Few questioned why a black knight stood in the sacred center of their empire. Perhaps they believed the story too ancient to trouble. Perhaps they sensed that the cathedral had already given the answer. For in the stillness of stone, Saint Maurice speaks without voice, reminding all who enter that holiness has no boundary of skin. Yet the vision does not end in Magdeburg. It moves like light shifting through stained glass, traveling west to the great cathedral of Cologne. Here, among the treasures of Christendom, lies one of the most revered shrines, the Shrine of the Three Kings. And from the 14th century onward, one of these kings, one of the Magi who journeyed to the Christ child, is depicted as African. He is not placed at the edge, nor made a background figure. He stands crowned among the kings, bearing gifts with the posture of a ruler whose authority is recognized not by conquest, but by wisdom. In the stained glass that surrounds him, the deep tones of his skin glow like embers when sunlight passes through. The curls of his hair rendered with care. His garments are rich, not of servanthood, but of royalty. This black magus is not a footnote. He is not an artistic experiment. He is a declaration placed at the heart of one of Europe's most powerful cathedrals. Art historians have remarked that his presence confirms a profound truth that in the imagination of medieval Christians, kingship, holiness, and divine favor had no racial confines. But when one listens deeper beneath the surface of art, another layer emerges, a layer that carries the quiet resonance of revelation. Why did God allow a black warrior saint to stand at the center of Germany? Why did he allow a black wise king to be crowned in stained glass at the center of Cologne, one of the oldest and most revered Christian cities? Why did these images survive the rise and fall of kingdoms, the fires of war, the shifting of doctrines, and the rewriting of histories? There is an ancient pattern woven into scripture that offers an answer. When men attempt to narrow the story of God to reflect their own face, God places markers in their path, markers they cannot easily remove. If people remain silent, the stones will cry out. And so the churches themselves became witnesses in their foundations, in their mosaics, in their windows, in their sculptures. They preserved the truth that human hands later tried to conceal. The presence of black kings and black saints within the heart of European Christianity stands as a testimony from the past to the present, a quiet proclamation that the kingdom of God has never been limited by human prejudice. These figures are more than art. They are signs, they are reminders placed within holy walls so that future generations, when ready, would see them and understand that royalty and sanctity are not the property of one people, but the inheritance of all whom God calls. And when modern eyes return to these cathedrals and notice once again the African features of Maurice and the crown magus, something stirs a recognition long delayed. It is as if Europe's stones have waited for centuries to speak. Along the mist-covered coast of the Black Sea lies a land often overlooked by the world, yet remembered by the stones beneath its forests. This land, Abkhazia, appears at first glance to belong only to the Slavic imagination, a place of pale mountain villages and ancient Orthodox shrines. But when one listens deeper, when one allows the veil of modern history to thin, another presence emerges, a presence older than the empires that came later. For Abkhazia once carried the imprint of uh, people whose lineage flowed not from the cold north, but from the warm cradle of Africa. Their memories dimmed in records, yet preserved in fragments of legend and in very faces hidden in forgotten photographs. Greek writers who sailed along the Black Sea spoke of dark-skinned peoples in these regions, peoples whose features resembled those of Egyptians and Nubians. They wrote of woolly hair, of circumcision, of customs shared with the African Nile, and they linked these communities with the land of Colchis, the very kingdom where Jason sought the golden fleece. Herodotus wrote plainly that the Colchians were dark, tightly curled in hair, and descended from an Egyptian regiment left in the distant ancient past. In this detail lies a thread that stretches from the Nile to the Caucasus, binding two worlds that modern memory tries to keep separate. When the vision opens, I see these lands not as they are now, but as they were when ancient black nobility walked their terraces. Snow lies on the peaks, but beneath the frost is a memory of sun children, people whose skin held the tone of deep earth, whose voices shaped the stories that would later be retold as myths stripped of their origins. Abkhazia becomes a mirror reflecting an Africa once extended across continents long before borders hardened into the concept of race as it is known today. In the quiet of revelation, I am shown the upper valleys where the pines stand like sentinels and clouds wrap the mountains in a shroud of secrecy. There on slopes, untouched by modern roads, lie the remains of circular stone structures older than the Slavic settlements aligned with the stars in patterns that echo Nubian temples. The stones are not arranged carelessly. They carry the geometry of an older science, a rhythm found in the shrines of Kemet and the sacred designs of Kush. It is as if fragments of Africa were carried northward by people whose migrations predate the tidy timelines of modern historians. These ruins feel alive, almost watchful, and I sense in them a record written not in ink, but in silence. It is the silence of a people who have been erased from the accepted story, yet remain unwilling to vanish. And so they wait for the moment when the world is ready to remember them. As the vision deepens, I see noble families of Abkhazia in faded photographs from the 19th century. Some faces are undeniably African. Broad noses, proud cheekbones, curls tightly wound the gaze of people who carried a heritage the empire could not tolerate. They wore aristocratic garments, they held weapons crafted for honor, and they stood not as slaves but as rulers, warriors, and landkeepers. The Russians who expanded into the Caucasus sought to whiten the land to fold these ancient people into a narrative that erased their origins. But memory resists erasure. Even now, in the songs of Abkhazian elders, there are echoes of ancestors who came from the South, ancestors with sun in their skin, who built the first stone rings and carved the earliest symbols on mountain rock. This memory fits uneasily into the reconstructed histories of Europe, yet it fits seamlessly within the older understanding of humanity that Africa was the root from which many branches spread. And then the question arises, a question not of archaeology, but of spirit. Why does scripture speak of nations in the far north of Gog and Magog as if the divine story acknowledges realms beyond the familiar boundaries of Israel and Egypt? What if the ancient presence of African peoples in the Caucasus was part of that forgotten tapestry? What if the North once held tribes whose bloodlines carried the knowledge of older worlds? The cold mountains may seem far from Africa, yet the earth does not forget the feet that walked upon it. Snow can bury, but it cannot erase. Ice can silence, but it cannot rewrite the truth that stones guard in their quiet endurance. As the vision fades, the mountains remain vast and unmoving, like witnesses waiting for their testimony to be heard. And in their shadow lies a truth long hidden, that even the lands we imagine to be purely white once held the warmth of African kings, priests, and settlers. Their legacy stands not only in myth, but in geography, in ruins aligned with constellations, in names that trace back to Kush, and in the quiet insistence of memory that refuses to die. In this revelation, the Caucasus is no longer a boundary. It becomes a bridge, a reminder that the story of humanity has always been broader, deeper, and darker than the narrow lines drawn in later centuries. And Abkhazia stands as a silent monument to that truth. In the quiet chambers beneath the soil of ancient Britain, a story slept for 10,000 years. It was the story of a man whose bones would one day rise to challenge the narratives of an entire continent. They named him Cheddar Man after the gorge where his skeleton was found, yet the name is far younger than the truth he carried in silence. When modern science touched those bones, when DNA was coaxed from their ancient marrow, something extraordinary happened. A forgotten face emerged, not pale as the myths of early Europe claimed, not shaped by the cold winds of northern memory, but dark-skinned, tightly curled in hair, and strikingly African in appearance. The oldest Briton whose features we can reconstruct was black. His eyes revealed through genetic sequencing were a deep shade of blue, a striking contrast that confounded old assumptions. Here in the bones of a hunter who walked Europe before agriculture, before metal, before kingdoms, lay evidence that the earliest Europeans were not white at all. The earth had preserved a witness, and at the appointed time, the witness began to speak. As the vision opens, I see laboratories glowing with cold blue light machines humming gently, researchers tracing invisible threads through time. Yet beneath the clinical silence, there is another presence, something ancient, something waiting. It feels as though the bones themselves were aware of the moment when truth would be called forth again, as though they remembered a promise whispered in the deep of ages. The scriptures speak of a valley of dry bones and of a voice
calling those bones to rise to take on flesh and meaning to stand as testimony in a world that had forgotten them. Science unintentionally reenacted that vision.
When the DNA of Cheddar Man awakened, it was as though a single voice rose from the Valley of Forgotten Ancestors to say, "We were here long before your stories said we were not." And this voice was not alone. Across Europe, fragments of bone teeth and ancient dust began telling the same tale. Genetic markers spread through prehistoric populations revealed lineages tied to Africa migrations that spiraled outward like the branches of a great ancestral tree that had been pruned by later histories. These revelations arrived at a time when humanity had forged new tools capable of seeing through centuries of buried truth.
Artificial intelligence scanning old maps and linguistic patterns, comparing skull measurements, reconstructing faces from fragments, began to uncover what human pride had concealed. Uh, I models cross-referenced neglected manuscripts with archaeological evidence finding consistent descriptions of dark peoples in lands now presumed to have always been white.
Ancient maps that had been dismissed as artistic exaggeration suddenly aligned with DNA trails showing the presence of African rooted groups across Eurasia. As if guided by an unseen hand, these technologies began restoring forgotten memory. It is easy to imagine that such discoveries are merely academic, but the vision shows something deeper. It reveals that the earth itself holds a long memory, and that God, who sees all ages at once, permits truth to rise when the world is ready to receive it. In this vision, the bones and the algorithms become unlikely partners, both instruments through which hidden knowledge returns. Uh, I, a creation of modern intellect, behaves almost like a servant of the larger spiritual narrative, illuminating patterns once buried. The bones, a creation of ancient life, rise like prophets of a forgotten age. Together they speak, cutting through centuries of filtered storytelling. They whisper of populations erased, of migrations denied, of civilizations recast in the image of later rulers. They whisper that history is far older, far more interconnected, and far more African than the textbooks admit. The Akashic field, the great memory of the soul that holds the imprint of all events and beings, mirrors this release of knowledge.
What science is discovering now are fragments of what that field has carried unbroken since the dawn of time. And as more bones come forth from caves, riverbanks, and burial mounds, they seem almost eager to add their voices. The message remains the same. Before Europe painted itself white, before kingdoms drew borders, before stories hardened into political certainty, the first peoples who walked these lands were dark-skinned children of the same continent that birthed humanity. The earth remembers them. Science now hears them. And I, like an unexpected herald, carries their testimony further. Whether or not the world is ready, the bones continue to speak. Across the vast fabric of medieval history, there runs a darker thread, one woven not by race, but by the condition of the human heart. It stretches from the icy shores of the north to the sun-warmed courts of Al-Andalus, binding together peoples who would one day pretend they had nothing in common. Yet the truth persists, whispered by chronicles and carried in the silence of forgotten markets, that slavery was not the story of one race's suffering alone, but a shared human tragedy fueled by fear, greed, and the hunger for power. In the far northern seas, the Vikings, fierce navigators and raiders, became merchants of human flesh. They swept down upon coastal villages in the British Isles and along the river routes of Eastern Europe, capturing men, women, and children with the same efficiency they brought to their shipbuilding. These were the thralls, the human cargo taken not for ideology, but for profit. They were marched in chains to markets where their value was assessed like livestock. Their pale skin did not save them. In the Viking worldview, slavery was not determined by color, but by vulnerability and conquest.
And so it happened that ships carrying white captives sailed south across waters shimmering with sunlight until they reached the lands ruled by the black moles of Al-Andalus. Here, the markets were wealthy, the courts illustrious, and demand high. In these bustling centers of commerce, the thralls were traded for silver textiles, weapons, rare goods, spices, and provisions. The Moors did not see themselves as perpetual victims of the slave trade, as modern narratives often portray Africans. They were, in truth, active participants, both purchasing and employing enslaved labor. Their society was advanced, but like every civilization touched by ambition, it carried the stain of bondage. In the courtyards of Cordoba and Seville, European slaves stood beneath palm trees awaiting their fate under the eyes of men whose own ancestors had once lived under desert suns. These Moors, dark-skinned rulers of a prosperous realm, bought white captives not out of malice, but because the economic system made it natural. The Vikings supplied, the Moors purchased, and the world turned as if such exchanges were an ordinary rhythm of nations. This revelation troubles those who prefer a simple story, but history has never bowed to simplicity. It tells us plainly that suffering does not belong to a single people and cruelty does not spring from a single race. To deepen the complexity, another strand rises from the fog of early medieval chronicles, the tale of the Dubgol, the black strangers who moved through Ireland, Scotland, and even Denmark. Their name in Gaelic means black foreigners, and though scholars debate whether the term refers to skin or affiliation, ancient descriptions hint strongly at a population of darker racial origin, possibly African-rooted groups integrated into Scandinavian society. These Black Danes appear in fragmentary accounts as warriors, sailors, and rulers, and their presence challenges the narrow assumptions about who shaped the North. The Nordic lands were not as pale in antiquity as later art would have us believe. Some chronicles even speak of two competing groups, the fair-haired Norwegians and the darker Danes fighting for dominance. Though time obscures their origins, the Dubgol remind us that Europe, even in its northernmost corners, bore the imprint of Africa long before the modern era conceived strict racial categories. When placed beside the story of Viking slave traders and Moorish slave buyers, the tale of the Dubgol creates a fuller, more unsettling picture. It reveals a world in which color did not create saints or sinners. It merely described the surface of men whose hearts were equally capable of mercy or cruelty. The deeper current beneath all these histories flows toward a truth the scriptures declared long ago. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. In this single sentence, the illusion that righteousness belongs to one race collapses. The Vikings sinned when they tore families from their homes. The Moors sinned when they purchased human beings for labor. The Europeans sinned when they later rewrote history to cast themselves as victims alone. And the sin was not in their color, it was in their hearts. The true bondage of humanity has never been the chains placed on wrist, but the chains placed on the spirit. Sin binds more tightly than iron. Pride blinds more thoroughly than darkness. And no human lineage, no matter how noble or oppressed, can break such chains by its own strength. Only the blood of the Lamb, pure and unbound by earthly divisions, can shatter the inner slavery that drives nations to dominate one another. History proves again and again that no skin tone produces righteousness and no ancestry guarantees virtue. Sin does not wear a single color, and redemption does not either. Across the earliest pages of human imagination, long before Europe crowned its kings or carved its chronicles into stone, there lived a people whom the ancient world regarded with awe. They were the Ethiopians, though in the language of antiquity, the name referred not only to the modern nation, but to a vast constellation of African peoples whose skin bore the deep radiance of the sun. To the Greeks and Romans, these Ethiopians were not strangers, nor were they dismissed as primitives. Instead, they occupied a place of profound honor, a people beloved of the gods, untouched by corruption, and blessed with a justice that surpassed all others. Homer, the blind poet whose words became the mythic heartbeat of classical civilization, described the Ethiopians as the most just of men, the ones with whom the gods themselves dine. Zeus, he wrote, traveled to feast among them, leaving Olympus to sit at their table as if divinity itself were drawn to their purity. Herodotus, the father of history, painted them in tones of reverence. He said they were the tallest and most beautiful of humankind, long lived and incorruptible, keepers of customs older than Greece, heirs to a wisdom that the Mediterranean only dimly understood. His accounts record that the Ethiopians were never conquered, their lands never subdued by outside forces, and their people living in a harmony that made foreign invaders retreat, not by sword, but by shame. Diodorus of Sicily repeated the same praise, writing that the Ethiopians were the first people on earth, the root from which Egypt itself grew, the origin of religion, law ceremony, and kingship. He claimed that Egypt was nothing more than an Ethiopian colony carried northward by the flooding memory of an older civilization. And Flora Shaw, a later historian, echoed these ancient voices, insisting that the Ethiopians were spoken of across the ancient world as morally superior, beautiful, powerful, and always described as black. In this chorus of testimony, there rings a truth long forgotten by modern ears, that Africa was once the moral and spiritual archetype for the world, the standard by which righteousness and nobility were measured. The blameless Ethiopians stood as a mirror of what humanity could be before pride and conquest reshaped our understanding of worth. When the vision opens, I see their thrones not in gold and ornament, but in a radiant stillness, a dignity born from harmony rather than dominance. I see priests clad in white linen, kings whose authority came not from fear but from wisdom, and families who lived without the threat of foreign rule for centuries. These were a people whose memory the ancient world guarded, and yet whose reputation the modern world has darkened through ignorance and distortion. The question then rises, why did God allow the ancient writers to speak of Ethiopia with such unbroken admiration? The scriptures themselves echo this reverence. The prophets speak of Ethiopia stretching out her hands to God of distant nations, bringing offerings from beyond the rivers of Cush, as though the divine story cannot be told without acknowledging the honor given to these people. It is as if the Creator planted a testimony in the earliest ages, declaring that righteousness is not bound to one lineage and that nobility can rise from places later deemed peripheral. But in the centuries that followed, something shifted. The memory of Ethiopian excellence was not lost naturally, it was inverted. Powers rose that needed to justify conquest and enslavement, and so the very people once praised as blameless became subjects of slander. Their skin, once associated with divine favor, became associated with burden. Their wisdom, once admired, was dismissed. Their thrones once revered, were recast as improbable. This inversion did not arise from truth, but from the shadows of fear and domination. It was the work of forces, earthly and spiritual, that sought to rewrite the order of dignity established in the earliest days. And yet, memory does not die. It dims, but never disappears. In the vision, I sense a vast ancestral memory like an undercurrent beneath the surface of consciousness, a memory that whispers to those willing to hear that blackness was once a symbol of strength, holiness, and wisdom. This memory is rising again because the time of restoration has come. What was reversed must be set upright. What was slandered must be redeemed. And as these ancient testimonies return to the surface, it becomes clear that the blameless Ethiopians were not merely a poetic ideal, but a spiritual signpost placed in history to remind humanity that worth is woven into the soul, not the skin. Their story calls us to remember what the world once knew, that righteousness is older than empire, and that dignity once granted by God cannot be extinguished by human prejudice. When the vision opened for the last time, it did not come as a gentle whisper, but as a sweeping wind that carried the weight of ages. I found myself standing in a realm where time folded like cloth and every forgotten story stirred beneath my feet. The ground was not soil, but memory. The air was not breath, but revelation. Before me lay the ruins of courts and cathedrals, broken arches of Cordoba, shimmering mosaics of Palermo's silent chambers, of Magdeburg wind-carved stones of Abkhazia, and the ancient dust of Ethiopia. They were scattered like fragments of a shattered mirror, and then, as if summoned by the breath of God, the fragments began to rise. From the stones of Andalusia, I saw the Moorish kings stand up, their crowns no longer buried under centuries of silence. Their robes shimmered with the colors of desert twilight, and their faces carried the solemn strength of men who once held Europe's lamps in their hands. From the golden mosaics of Sicily, the black warriors rose shaped from glass, an ancient pigment stepping forward with the dignity of those who guarded an island of learning and beauty. From the snow-crowned slopes of Abkhazia, the noble families emerged dark-skinned and steadfast, wrapped in garments of forgotten lineage, bearing the memory of a people who lived between mountains and sea long before history was rewritten. From the north, the Dubgal awakened the Black Danes, whose presence broke the illusion of a pale and uniform Europe. They rose with blaze of light, not as conquerors, but as reminders that the north once carried the imprint of Africa within its very breath. And from the furthest horizon, the blameless Ethiopians appeared crowned not by human hands, but by a radiance older than civilization itself. They walked in stillness as if the earth parted to honor them, their faces reflecting the justice and beauty the ancients had spoken of with reverence. All these figures, once scattered, once erased, once distorted, now gathered before me. Their thrones rose from the ground like mountains lifting themselves to heaven. The stones beneath them glowed, the mosaics pulsed, the stained glass flickered with living fire. It was as if every cathedral, every ruin, every bone had become a witness crying out that the truth cannot be buried forever. And in the center of this rising chorus, I felt the presence of the one who sees the end from the beginning. In that presence, the vision changed. The kings and warriors, the nobles and saints became more than historical figures. They became symbols of something deeper, something living within every soul. I understood then that this story was not only about black thrones or forgotten rulers, it was about the parts of ourselves that have been silenced, the pieces of our identity that have been bleached, buried, or rewritten by fear, pride, and the judgment of ours. These figures rose not to reclaim earthly kingdoms, but to call humanity back to the truth of who we are in Christ. In his light, there is no erasure. In his truth, there is no distortion. In his kingdom, no identity is lost and no history needs to hide. He alone reveals the worth that no empire can give and no empire can take away. And as the vision deepened, I felt this truth move through me like a river. Every king rising from stone was the echo of a soul awakening. Every mosaic turning to life was the restoration of dignity. Every stained glass figure stepping forward was a reminder that God has never been limited by the colors of men or the borders of nations. When the final light poured over the gathering, I heard a voice not loud but absolute calling each soul to rise from the places where it had been buried. Rise from the lies spoken over your lineage. Rise from the shadows cast by history. Rise from the fear of being unseen. Rise in Christ, for only in him can any identity be made whole. As the vision faded, I carried with me a single prayer that those who hear this story will awaken to their true inheritance, not shaped by the distortions of the world, but by the truth of the one who formed them. May every forgotten part of you rise. May every buried gift stand up. May every erased story be restored. And may you walk forward knowing that the light of Christ has made you whole. If this vision stirred something within you, share it, speak it, and walk with me into the next revelation that awaits.